Peru's APRA ran an energetic and inspiring election campaign in 1931 that drew tens of thousands of people into electoral politics for the first time. After a century of military and oligarchic rule, the workers and the peasants of Peru finally had a party that was willing to run on policies that would benefit them, and which treated them as more or less equal partners in a mass political struggle rather than as subordinates who could be bought off through clientelism. For the Apristas who participated in this campaign and who witnessed the vibrancy and energy of the party's local cells, it was not hard to believe that they were taking part in a historic moment that would be at least as transformational for Latin American politics as the Mexican and Russian revolutions over a decade earlier. The APRA's victory in 1931 would push aside the military regime that had seized power the previous year, along with the old oligarchy that had preceded it. And it would bring a well-organized socialist party to power in a Latin American country for the first time in history. And that would be just the beginning. The Aprista government in Peru would provide material and moral support to anti-imperialist rebel movements in other countries, such as the movements led by Sandino in Nicaragua and Farabundo Martí in El Salvador. Over the longer term, the party's rise to power in Peru would galvanize a new transnational political movement that would finally liberate Latin America from the influence of foreign governments and businesses. But of course, none of that happened in the end. The APRA did not win Peru's 1931 presidential election, and it would not win the national presidency until the mid-1980s, several years after its founder, Aya de la Torre, had died. And by that point, the APRA had already abandoned most of its original socialist and anti-imperialist ideals over a generation earlier. In this video, we are going to examine why everything ultimately went so wrong for this exceptionally well-organized political party. As we are going to see, the APRA did make several mistakes during its elusive quest for power. But even if it had played its hand perfectly, that still probably would not have been enough to reverse its fortunes. At the end of the day, the APRA was always playing a game that it was just never going to be allowed to win. Its ideology, rhetoric, and tactics inspired genuine fear among its opponents, and those opponents were prepared to annul elections, carry out coups, and tear down Peru's democracy itself whenever there was even a hint that the APRA might come to power. In the 1931 presidential campaign, the APRA's candidate, founder, and leader, Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre, won 35% of the national popular vote. These are perfectly respectable numbers for a brand new opposition party and a candidate who had spent most of the last decade in exile. But Aya de la Torre ultimately loses this election to the right-wing military candidate Luis Miguel Sanchez Cerro, who wins a slight majority of the vote. The APRA refuses to concede defeat in 1931, and it alleges that Sanchez Cerro had resorted to electoral fraud in order to win this election. The APRA points to the fact that Sanchez Cerro was the leader of the military junta that had taken power the previous year, and it claims that the junta stole this election in order to perpetuate itself in power. However, an arguably more decisive factor behind Sanchez Cerro's victory was his ability to gain the support of Peru's oligarchic political establishment, which was alarmed by the APRA's populist and socialist rhetoric, and which saw Sanchez Cerro as the lesser of two evils compared to a radical like the Aprista leader Aya de la Torre. While the APRA failed to win the presidency in 1931, it did win 27 of the seats in the Constituent Assembly that was going to write Peru's new constitution. And as a highly disciplined party, the Aprista delegation would be well positioned to exert a disproportionate amount of influence over the assembly and the constitution. But around 2 months into the Constituent Assembly session, President Sanchez Cerro seizes emergency power and he issues a decree that expels the Aprista delegation from the Constituent Assembly. Most of the Aprista assembly members are deported from the country, while the party's leader, Aya de la Torre, is imprisoned. Most Apristas take this crackdown as proof that the system is rigged against their party. And as rumors spread that Aya de la Torre is being tortured in prison, many of the party's members decide that Sanchez Cerro must be removed from power through force. The APRA stages a series of uprisings in 1932, the largest and most important of which takes place in Aya de la Torre's hometown of Trujillo in northwestern Peru. On July 7th, a group of Apristas seize control over the artillery barracks in the city, and they take several army officers hostage. This initial success provokes a city-wide insurrection the following morning that overthrows the city's government and places Trujillo under the APRA's control. Meanwhile, the army has been mobilized to retake the city, and when the military learns that the captive artillery officers had all been executed, it seeks to avenge their deaths by unleashing a massacre against the city's population that leaves several thousand civilians dead. The military drops bombs onto the city from airplanes, and once it recaptures Trujillo, it executes thousands of suspected members of the APRA without trial. The insurrection of Trujillo transforms the APRA from an ordinary instrument of mass incorporation into a party that sees itself as the vanguard of a heroic and almost religious crusade against Peru's military and political establishment. July 7th, the day of the initial insurrection, becomes one of the party's most important holidays, and the APRA holds annual events in Trujillo to commemorate its fallen comrades. But the Apristas are not the only ones who keep the memory of the Revolution of Trujillo alive. Peru's army holds its own annual ceremony to commemorate the deaths of the captive artillery officers who were believed to have been executed by the Aprista rebels. The military was never much of a friend of the APRA to begin with, but in the aftermath of the 1932 insurrection, the military transforms into the APRA's most implacable and bitter opponent. And in the decades to come, the military will work even harder than Peru's oligarchy to block the APRA from ever taking power. The Revolution of Trujillo also affects the APRA's party image among the general public. Although the military was responsible for the vast majority of the deaths at Trujillo, Aprismo becomes strongly associated with violence among much of Peru's population, and the country's upper class and military start to think of the APRA as more of a terrorist organization than a legitimate electoral political party. The APRA's reputation for violence is further reinforced by the assassination of President Sanchez Cerro by an APRA member a year later. With the president dead, the Congress appoints the former military dictator Oscar Benavides to serve out the rest of the presidential term. Benavides immediately bans the APRA, and the APRA remains underground for the next 12 years. At the end of the term in 1936, Benavides agrees to hold a new election, and since the APRA is now banned, the two main contenders are Luis Antonio Eguiguren from the very centrist Social Democratic Party and the establishment politician Jorge Prado, who had been part of the now-defunct Civil Party. While the APRA is proscribed from running its own candidates, it remains the best organized party in Peru, and it plays the role of kingmaker in this election by instructing its members and supporters to vote for Iguiguren. Thanks to the APRA's support, Iguiguren wins the election by a comfortable margin. But the Congress immediately annuls this election after the fact, on the ground that Iguiguren had received the support of a party that is now banned. Benavides remains in office beyond the end of Sanchez Cerro's original term, though they finally get around to holding a new election in 1939. This time, most of Peru's parties are banned, and the election is easily won by Manuel Prado, the brother of the establishment candidate in the last election. The political situation in Peru stabilizes under Prado's presidency, and the APRA tries again in the next election in 1945. This time, the APRA endorses José Luis Bustamante, who is also supported by the socialist left, much of the oligarchy, and even the former dictator Oscar Benavides. Thanks to this establishment support, Bustamante is allowed to assume office, and he immediately re-legalizes the APRA. For the first time since the 1930s, the APRA finally re-emerges from underground, and it embarks on a mass membership drive to re-enroll the members who had drifted away from the party during its proscription. Later that year, Aprista labor activists gained control over the country's largest labor organization, the Confederation of Peruvian Workers, and this brings the APRA to the height of its power in the labor movement. The APRA gains greater influence in Bustamante's government in 1946 after the party sweeps a series of special elections to Congress, and APRA members are appointed to lead several ministries in Bustamante's cabinet. However, the alliance between the APRA and Bustamante abruptly collapses in early 1947 when the conservative newspaper editor Francisco Graña Garland is assassinated and the APRA is accused of being behind his murder. Bustamante dismisses the Aprista members from the cabinet, and the APRA withdraws its support from Bustamante's government. This leads the president to rely more heavily on the support of the military for the remainder of his presidency. Both the military and much of the economic elite pressured Bustamante to ban the APRA once again. And when the president refuses, the military removes him from power in a coup, and it stages a crackdown on the APRA that leads to the arrest of around 1,000 Aprista members. The military government remains in power for the next 8 years, and during that time, the APRA moves sharply to the right of the ideological spectrum as it enters into a period known as the convivencia, or coexistence. The party's leader, Aya de la Torre, has calculated that the only way that the party will ever be allowed to win executive power is if it reaches an accommodation with Peru's oligarchy and military. And such an accommodation will only be possible if the APRA moderates its rhetoric and policies and abandons its former revolutionary posturing. In 1954, near the end of the dictatorship, Aya de la Torre publishes an article in Life magazine in which he renounces his former socialism and he declares that capitalism offers the surest solution to the world's problems. Aya de la Torre reaffirms this position a year later in his book, 30 Years of Aprismo, where he works to distance the party from Marxism and soften its revolutionary, anti-imperialist stance. Peru experiences a wave of pro-democracy protests in the early 1950s, but the APRA is largely absent from this movement, and the party leadership even works to de-escalate labor unrest by reining in the unions under its influence and ordering them not to strike. Then, when democratic elections are held again starting in 1956, the Aprista leadership endorses the more right-wing presidential candidate, the former president and establishment politician Manuel Prado, who is also supported by the outgoing dictator Odria. In return for this support, Prado promises to re-legalize the APRA and back Aya de la Torre's own presidential bid in the next election in 1962. There are two common interpretations of the APRA's ideological and strategic shifts during the Convivencia period. Under the first interpretation, the APRA's moderation is mostly superficial, and it is a calculated move by Aya de la Torre to get his party accepted by the Peruvian political establishment so that the APRA will be able to enact its original program someday in the future. Under the second interpretation, the party's moderation is largely sincere, and Aya de la Torre and other senior party leaders have lost faith in the party's original revolutionary program during their long years in exile and prison, and they are now seeking to do whatever it takes to share in the spoils of government before they die. In either case, the party's shift to the ideological right, and especially its endorsement of an oligarchic politician like Manuel Prado, both confuses and horrifies many of the party's rank-and-file members, who had been attracted to the APRA in the first place due to its revolutionary, uncompromising opposition to establishment politicians like Prado. Many of these members desert the APRA during Prado's second presidency, while others push to democratize the party and reverse the APRA's shift to the right. In the APRA's 1959 convention, the party leadership heads off this dissident movement by expelling its socialist faction from the party. These socialist Apristas eventually found a new organization called the Revolutionary Left Movement, or APRA Rebelde, which is based on a mixture of Aprista and Marxist doctrine. The 1962 election is a three-way race between Aya de la Torre, the centrist reformist politician Fernando Belaúnde Terry, and the former dictator Manuel Odria. This election is the first presidential election that the APRA has been allowed to compete in since 1931, and it is therefore a big test of the resilience of the party's mass support over the last 3 decades. Aya de la Torre ends up winning 33% of the vote, which suggests that the APRA has largely retained most of its popular following throughout decades of repression. Aya de la Torre also wins slightly more votes than the two rival candidates, Belaúnde and Odria. However, under Peru's constitution at the time, a candidate needed 1/3 of the vote in order to be elected outright, and Aya de la Torre falls just 0.3 of a percentage point beneath this threshold. This means that it is now up to Congress to decide who the next president will be. Most people expect that the Congress will end up electing Aya de la Torre anyway. But before the Congress can meet to finalize this decision, the military stages yet another coup in order to nullify this 1962 election. The military is not interested in running a long-term dictatorship this time, and they step down in order to redo the election a year later with the same 3 contenders. Aya de la Torre improves his vote share slightly in 1963, and he finally crosses the 1/3 threshold. However, his rival Belaúnde Terry improves his own vote share by even more, and he defeats Aya de la Torre in this 1963 presidential election. Fernando Belaúnde Terry is a pro-democracy reformist who ostensibly shares many of the APRA's policy goals, including a land reform. Nevertheless, the Aprista leadership decides to oppose Belaúnde's government, and the APRA joins with the supporters of the former dictator Odria to form a majority opposition alliance in the Congress that blocks most of Belaúnde's policy agenda while greatly watering down his land reform bill. By the mid-1960s, Belaúnde's government also faces several left-wing guerrilla groups, including APRA Rebelde. Meanwhile, his main coalition partner, the Christian Democratic Party, has deserted him, his own party, Popular Action, has fractured, and his administration is dealing with the fallout of a succession of scandals. Belaúnde manages to hold on for most of his term, but he is finally overthrown in a military coup in 1968. The APRA is banned and repressed once again, and Peru remains under military rule all the way until 1980, a year after Aya de la Torre's death. So what explains the APRA's failure to gain power during its founder's lifetime? The biggest obstacles standing in the party's way were a military and an oligarchic political establishment that were both determined to lock the APRA out of power at all costs. Although many of the APRA's claims of electoral fraud in 1931 and 1962 were dubious, it is clear that the deck was stacked against the APRA. The APRA was banned in one form or another in most of the elections held during the mid-20th century, and Aya de la Torre's likely victory in 1962 was effectively annulled by a military coup. The APRA simply was not allowed to win executive power through an election, and this left the party with no good options for taking power in a way that would have been viewed as legitimate by the bulk of Peru's population. The APRA's revolutionary struggle in the early 1930s did not even come close to displacing Sanchez Cerro's government from power at the national level, and it arguably backfired for the party over the long run by hardening the resolve of its enemies and by fueling the APRA's not entirely undeserved reputation for political violence in the eyes of the general public. During its lengthy proscription, the APRA demonstrated an impressive ability to influence the trajectory of Peruvian politics from behind the scenes. But during the presidencies of Bustamante and especially Belaúnde Terry, the APRA revealed itself to be a less than constructive force for democratic stability, and the APRA's selfishness contributed greatly to the breakdowns of democracy in 1948 and 1968. The APRA's attempt to accommodate itself to the political establishment during the convivencia period in the 50s and 60s ultimately failed to secure Aya de la Torre's election, and it came at an enormous ideological cost for the party that shed the APRA of all of the principles and radicalism that might have made it a force for genuine political transformation. Yet Aya de la Torre's decision to moderate the party does highlight one of the central dilemmas for leftist parties in Latin America during the era of mass politics. Parties that promise sweeping political and economic transformation are often in the best position to mobilize the masses of the population that have traditionally been excluded from the political system. But those same promises make the party an existential threat to the existing political establishment. Peru's oligarchy and military alike were genuinely terrified of what might happen if the APRA ever won power. And that fear was the single most important reason why an Aprista victory was never allowed to happen. In the end, the APRA never lived up to its full potential as a mass party, but its sheer resilience during decades of proscription and repression does demonstrate the value of a strong party organization. While the APRA failed to expand its base beyond its original third of the electorate, it did manage to hold on to its popular following throughout Aya de la Torre's lifetime. And this is no insignificant feat in a party system as fluid and chaotic as Peru's. The APRA's resilience was due in large part to the exceptional strength of its party organization and its ability to keep the Aprista subculture alive even after the party began its drift to the right. Despite Ayala de Torres' transnational ambitions, when he first founded the APRA in the 1920s, the Peruvian Aprista party ended up being the only significant Aprista party in Latin America. But the APRA was an important influence on leftist and populist parties throughout much of the region, and many parties in other countries adopted elements of the Aprista ideology and organizational model. In our next video, we are going to examine the formative years of one of the most successful parties that the APRA helped inspire, the Socialist Party of Chile. The Chilean socialists and the Peruvian Apristas were so close in the mid-20th century that the two parties described each other as sister parties, and each party routinely sent delegates to the other party's national conventions. The Socialist Party of Chile is going to face many of the same dilemmas as the APRA, though it will ultimately be more successful than its older sister at navigating these challenges. And within less than a decade after its foundation, it will become the first leftist party in South America to gain a significant degree of political power at the national level.